What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, minutes before her wedding, my sister leaned in close and told me not to wear anything fancy because I would embarrass her. I just smiled, but in that moment something inside me shifted because it was not the first time she had tried to make me smaller, and I suddenly realized I had been letting her do it for years, always keeping my head down. Always making myself less visible just to keep the peace, while quietly paying the bills, fixing the emergencies, and showing up when no one else could manage it. You have to understand, in my family, I was always the reliable one, the one who stayed up through nights of exams, who picked up double shifts, who missed holidays because someone needed to cover the ER, and who paid for things that no one else wanted to talk about. When my dad needed hand surgery and his insurance deductible was too high, I swiped my card without hesitation, because it was either that or let him suffer through pain he did not deserve. When Grandma slipped and needed a rehab center across the state, it was me who paid for her flight, because the others were too busy arguing about who was responsible. Every time I was there. And yet, whenever Madison wanted the spotlight, I was told to step back, to keep quiet, to let her have her moment, because apparently I was intimidating or too serious or not fun enough for pictures. The night before the wedding, she called me and made her list clear. No fancy attire, nothing that would draw attention, no speaking unless I was directly asked, and absolutely no mention of my work. I nodded along, pretending to take it seriously, but deep down I was exhausted. I remembered our mother's words, passed down through Grandma, that silence makes you invisible. For so long I thought being invisible was safer, but that whisper the morning of her wedding was the moment I decided I was done playing along. So while she thought she had silenced me, I quietly set my own plan in motion. I texted the hospital coordinator to confirm the recognition ceremony that was supposed to happen later in the day, a small honor they were awarding me for my community clinic hours and research work. I asked if the medal could be delivered earlier. Within minutes, they wrote back, yes. Then I messaged Tyler, her fiancé, who had pulled me aside weeks before and begged me to keep things calm because he knew how Madison could spiral. I reassured him I would handle it. What I did not tell him was that my version of handling it would not be what he expected. I thought about the years of birthdays where my presents for Madison were dismissed as too practical, the nights where my achievements were brushed aside so hers could shine, and the countless times I was told not to mention medical school because it made her look unaccomplished. And I thought about how ridiculous it was that the one day I had been asked to show up for her, after decades of showing up for everyone, I was being told to make myself small again. Something in me just snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. So when I opened my garment bag that morning, it was not a dress waiting inside. It was my white doctor's coat. I smoothed it out, laid the medal across the breast pocket, and finally allowed myself to smile for real. Not the kind of smile you force when you are trying to keep the peace, but the kind that comes from knowing you are about to stop playing by someone else's script. I decided in that moment that my silence had expired, and while I was not going to scream or fight or ruin her day, I was going to take back the room in the cleanest way possible, by standing exactly as I am without apology, without lowering my light, and without playing second place in a story that I had carried more than my share of. This changes the rules forever. When people ask me why I reacted so strongly to that one whisper before the wedding, I always want to laugh because they think it was just about that single moment, as if I was overreacting to a small comment. But what they never saw were the years stacked up behind it, the patterns so obvious that once you stepped back it practically shouted at you, and the truth is that whisper was just the latest in a long line of digs, cuts, and quiet edits that my sister had been making for as long as I could remember, each one small enough to pass off as nothing, but altogether heavy enough to bend me into a version of myself that played small just so she could shine. I can still remember in high school when I won a regional science award after weeks of staying up late and skipping social events. An award that actually mattered to me because it was one of the first times I felt like my work was being recognized outside our family. And yet at the dinner table that night, before I could even share the details, Madison interrupted me with her story about being chosen for homecoming court, and the room lit up with applause for her, while my award certificate stayed folded in my bag, unmentioned and unseen. It was not malicious in the loud way people imagine sibling rivalry, but more of a constant quiet redirecting of the spotlight, and over time I internalized the idea that maybe my achievements were better kept private. Because whenever I tried to share them, they were treated as if they somehow stole oxygen from hers. The pattern showed up again at her bridal shower just a few months earlier, when I walked in and saw that the seating chart had me tucked away at a table near the vendors, not with family, not with friends, but in the back corner. And when I asked about it, she brushed it off with, "You're practical, you won't mind," as if practicality was a label that excused her from treating me like I belonged. It was always like that. I was practical, I was dependable, I was strong, all those words that sound positive until you realize they are being used as excuses to take you for granted, to push you out of the frame so the picture looks better for someone else. The days leading up to the wedding were a perfect continuation of that same script. She asked me to cover a last-minute vendor cost, some upgrade to the flowers that she just had to have, and I paid the invoice without complaint, until I overheard her telling relatives later that Tyler had covered it as a sweet gesture. That was the moment I decided the pattern only continued because I kept allowing it, because I kept paying, smoothing, stepping aside, and swallowing my pride. So I called the vendor, canceled the payment, and told them directly that any adjustments would need to be handled through the planner. That small act felt almost shocking to me, like lifting a weight I had been carrying so long I forgot it was there, and of course Madison noticed immediately, because she stormed into my room and accused me of ruining her day. Her words were sharp, but her panic was sharper, because what she really meant was that I had stopped being her safety net, and that was terrifying to her. For once, I did not raise my voice or try to defend myself in circles. I just looked at her and said I was done being her quiet wallet and her background, and if that ruined her day, then maybe her day was more fragile than she wanted to admit. When she ran to Dad, I braced for his disappointment, and sure enough, he came to me with that same old request I had heard since I was a teenager. "Please, Elena, just keep the peace. Don't make this harder than it already is." But something about the way he said it this time made me realize that peace in our family had never been peace at all. It had been me swallowing everything while Madison got to live unbothered, and I told him calmly that I was keeping the peace, just not her version of it. That night, as if fate wanted to push the point further, the wedding planner texted me saying the officiant had asked if a tribute to our late mother should stay in the ceremony, because my name had come up in connection to it. And apparently Madison had been trying to cut it out to save time. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed a single word back, "Yes." I knew what that meant. It meant I was stepping into the spotlight whether Madison wanted it or not, because our mother deserved to be remembered, and because for once I was not going to let my sister's obsession with optics erase the people and values that actually mattered. It was not about vengeance in the way people imagine revenge stories. It was about finally calling out a pattern that had gone unchecked for decades, and doing it in a way that was impossible to spin or silence. And, while part of me still felt the weight of Dad's voice asking me to keep things calm, another part of me, the part that had carried this family in ways no one ever gave me credit for, felt a quiet thrill knowing that calm was not always the same as silence, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say yes when someone expects you to say nothing. As I closed my phone and looked over at my white coat hanging on the chair, I realized that the rules of our family had always been tilted against me, but this time I was rewriting them, and I could almost hear Madison's voice in my head, panicked and controlling, as she realized I was no longer playing my assigned role. What she did not know yet was that the tribute was only the beginning, and the real storm was coming, because if she thought she could keep me small forever, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The morning finally rolled forward into that tight window, where everyone starts moving like a machine that has been wound a little too hard. And while the stylist pinned Madison into a version of herself that matched her mood board, and the planner whispered timing into a headset like a coach calling plays, my phone buzzed with a call from the hospital coordinator, who said the board wanted to shift the small recognition for my community clinic hours and research project to earlier in the day if I could step aside for a moment between the ceremony and the reception, which meant I needed to stay reachable, remain sober, and be ready to authorize a telehealth update if one of my patients spiked in the system. And when I said that worked for me because I would already be keeping a low profile, the coordinator laughed in the kind way people laugh when they think they are helping and said that if I chose to wear my white coat for the pinning, they could hand me the medal then. Which is how I knew the timing had lined up in a way I had not even planned, because now the decision was no longer symbolic. It was procedural and real and bound to policy that I actually care about. I told Madison and Tyler exactly what the hospital had told me. I explained that I had to remain on call with my pager live in my pocket, that I would not be drinking, and that if a patient alert hit my phone, I would step into a quiet corner for 2 minutes to give an order or clear a question. And before Tyler could get a word in, she rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic with the coat and the medal and the whole doctor performance, and that for once I could just be a normal sister and not make the day about me, and I felt that familiar heat rise in my chest that usually makes me shut down or apologize, but I took a breath and said as evenly as I could that the coat was not a prop or a costume or a trick, that it is literally the uniform I wear when I am accountable for people's lives and choices, and that I would not be compromising my standards or my hospital policy to fit her timeline, and that if she wanted to be mad about that, she could be mad at the system and not at me. Tyler, who has that polite way of talking that tells you he grew up smoothing other people's moods, pulled me into the hallway and asked if there was any chance I could swap my on-call shift to make things easier. And I told him I could have tried a week ago, but the schedule had locked, and anyway I was not going to teach my residents that personal events outrank patient safety, which he actually understood. Because he said he respects that line even if it complicates the day, and he asked me to make him a quiet promise that whatever I did, I would not turn it into a public fight, and I told him I had no interest in fighting at all, that what I wanted was clarity, structure, and a version of the day that told the truth about who we are and what we value without tearing anyone down, which seemed to calm him enough that he went back to Madison with a careful tone. The one you use when someone you love is set on controlling 1,000 tiny details, so they do not have to think about the one big thing they cannot control. I checked my pocket for my mother's graduation pin the way some people check for house keys, because I had brought it in a small envelope after Grandma pressed it into my hand the week before, and I remembered the conversation on her couch when she said, without any of the sugarcoating our family uses to avoid conflict, that our mother would never have wanted any of her daughters to shrink, and that if a day required me to vanish in order to keep it smooth, then the day was not as beautiful as the photos would make it look, and I think that sentence rewired me in a way that made everything clear, because I could finally see the difference between being considerate and being erased. The planner, who by this point knew more about our family than any outsider should, asked me for a final answer on the tribute, and I said yes again. And I also asked her to place it right after the vows while people were still focused and before the noise of clinking glasses could drown out anything meaningful, and I promised her I would keep it under 2 minutes and center it on gratitude and our mother's name. And I added that I wanted no slideshow, no music cue, nothing theatrical, because this was not a performance, but a marker, a line in the story that would not be walked back once it was said out loud. When I went back to the dressing room, Madison tried one last push, telling me that if I insisted on wearing the coat, I should at least leave the medal at home and keep the pager out of sight because it would look tacky in pictures. And I told her the medal was not about pictures, it was about work that mattered, and that the pager stays on because my patients do not disappear just because she wants a clean aesthetic, and she called me selfish in that careless way people sling a word when what they mean is inconvenient, and I said nothing because the decision had already been made and I did not need her permission or her blessing to be the version of myself I have fought for years to become. Dad popped in to ask, again, if we could all keep the peace and not upset Madison, and I told him I was keeping the most important kind of peace, the kind where no one lies about who they are or what they do. And he sighed the sigh of a man who has chosen quiet over truth for a long time and does not yet see the cost, and he gave me a look that said I was about to make his day harder. While Grandma reached for my lapel and pinned our mother's small gold pin next to the hospital badge with hands that did not shake, and she leaned in close and said, not softly but with finality, that it was time to take the room back without raising my voice, and that if anyone asked why, I could tell them it was because our mother raised daughters to show up, not to vanish. I slipped my arms into the white coat, felt the metal settle where it belonged, slid the pager into the pocket where it would buzz if needed, and as the planner opened the doors and the music swelled in that predictable way weddings do, I realized that for the first time in years I was walking into a room not to fix it or fund it or disappear inside it, but to stand in it exactly as myself. Which is why when the coordinator's text came through saying the board was in the lobby with the medal and ready whenever I was, I smiled without apology, because the timing was perfect, the lines were drawn, and in 1 minute the day would stop being only Madison's performance and start becoming a story I was willing to live. When the music swelled and the doors opened, I felt the weight of every eye turn toward the entrance, and for the first time in my life I did not feel the impulse to shrink or hide or apologize for existing in the space, because I walked in wearing the coat that had taken me more than a decade of grueling training, endless nights, missed holidays, and sacrifices most people in that room would never fully understand. And across the breast pocket hung the medal that had been handed to me not for being anyone's daughter or anyone's sister, but for the work I had done and the people I had helped, and the sound that met me was not silence, not applause, but a sharp collective gasp that seemed to ripple through the guests in a way no choreographed moment ever could. I saw Aunt Carol put her hand over her mouth and then lower it with a grin that said more than words, and I caught Grandma's eyes shining not with tears, but with that fierce pride she never tried to hide. And in the same frame I caught Dad's face freeze into the kind of expression men use when they want to pretend nothing is happening, but their jaw gives them away, and then I noticed Tyler's shoulders rise with tension as he glanced at Madison, who stood stiff, her hand clutching the bouquet so tightly that I thought the stems might snap, and in that instant I knew she was calculating, not the vows, not the meaning of the day, but the optics, the photographs, the narrative she thought she had already written. The ceremony went forward as planned, the vows delivered with the scripted sincerity that weddings often demand, and I stood where I was supposed to stand, not speaking, not disrupting, not stepping out of line, but the coat spoke for me. And no matter how many times Madison tried to flick her eyes away from me, the guests did not follow, because the energy in the room had shifted, and they all sensed that something unspoken had entered the space and refused to leave. Then the moment I had prepared for arrived, not with drama, not with tension, but with the planner's simple nod, and the officiant gave me the microphone as though it were the most natural handoff in the world. I stepped forward, adjusted the metal lightly so it did not clink against the mic, and I said the only words I had rehearsed, that our mother cared about two things more than anything else in the world, showing up and lifting others without making them smaller, and that it seemed only right, on a day meant to celebrate love and partnership, that her name not be forgotten. I explained that in her honor and in recognition of what this marriage could represent at its best, I had established a small annual scholarship for a young woman entering community medicine, and that it was registered under both Madison and Tyler's names as the first act of generosity from them as a couple. The air shifted again, this time into a silence so thick it was almost physical, because the guests did not know whether to clap or to hold their breath. And I could feel Madison's fury vibrating through the space even before she lunged forward to grab the microphone from me, her face flushed not with gratitude but with panic, because she realized in that second that I had placed her in a corner she could not escape without exposing herself completely. I calmly passed the microphone not back to her but to the officiant, who closed the moment with a simple "thank you" before continuing the ceremony without a hiccup, and in doing so sealed the tribute as part of the official record of the day, something no amount of spinning or editing could erase from the story or the photos or the memories. As I stepped back to my seat, the whispers began, not cruel but curious, as guests leaned toward one another and said things like, "I didn't know she had done that," or "what an incredible tribute," and some even said, "that's what family is supposed to mean." And in those murmurs I could hear the shift in narrative happening in real time, the rewriting of roles that had been cemented for decades. For years, I had been cast as the reliable background figure, the one who did the work but never got the mention, and in a single move the story was different, because now I had given the room something Madison could not control: legacy. I noticed Tyler watching me carefully, his face caught somewhere between admiration and fear, because while he likely respected what I had done, he also knew the explosion that was brewing in his new wife's mind. And when Madison disappeared a moment later with her phone clenched in her hand, he followed, not running but moving fast enough that everyone saw, and the buzz in the room grew louder as speculation filled the space. Dad stormed toward me with his voice low but his tone sharp, demanding to know why I had hijacked the day, and before I could answer, Aunt Carol leaned in from the side and said loudly enough for half the table to hear that no one had hijacked anything, that I had simply spoken the truth while keeping my dignity, and that if truth ruined the day, then the day was not worth much to begin with. I turned back to my glass of water and took a slow sip, because I had no intention of defending myself against accusations that had no weight. And I let the chatter roll around me like static until Grandma placed her hand gently over mine and whispered that sometimes silence is power, but sometimes silence is surrender, and what I had done was refuse surrender. And she told me that was exactly what my mother would have wanted. The cake knives clattered in the back as the staff scrambled to adjust the schedule. The guests leaned into their speculation with increasing boldness, and as Dad's anger mounted and Aunt Carol's defense grew sharper, I sat in the middle of it with a calm I had not known I was capable of, because I realized that no matter how Madison tried to spin it, the room had already shifted, the script had already been broken, and the truth had already landed in a way that could not be undone. Can you guess what happened next? The thing about a room that has just watched a script unravel is that everyone pretends to settle. Glasses are lifted, chairs inch forward, and the playlist tries to glue the air back together. Yet the energy hums with the knowledge that something truer than the schedule has taken the stage, and in that charged space Tyler found me first, not with accusations or rehearsed lines, but with the strained honesty of a man who knew he had married someone he loved and also knew that love had never trained him for the exact pressure of this moment, and he said that Madison had been spiraling for weeks about comparisons and images, and the fear that my presence would turn her into a side character. And he said he had begged me to keep the day calm because he did not know what else to do, and I told him that I had kept it calm in the only way that mattered to me, which meant I had refused to lie by disappearing, and I had refused to fight by humiliating anyone, and that I had placed a tribute on the table that was bigger than me or Madison or even the wedding, because it placed our mother's name at the center of a story that had tried to edit her out. And he exhaled in that way people do when the truth finally arrives and all you can do is admit you recognize it. And he squeezed my hand and said he respected what I had done and feared what would come next, and I said both reactions were reasonable. Dad swept in right after, moving with the practiced authority of a man who has always believed that raising your voice a half notch and using the word family was enough to end a debate. And he told me I had hijacked the only day Madison ever wanted to be perfect, and that there had been 1,000 other weekends to announce honors and donations, and that even if my intentions were good, the result had been chaos. But I stayed seated because the old impulse to rise and justify and take blame had burned off like fog, and I explained that the tribute had taken less than 2 minutes, that it had asked nothing of anyone except acknowledgement of values our mother lived by, and that the only chaos in the room was the shock of seeing me refuse to vanish again, and he threw up his hands in that familiar gesture that means you will not be moved, and he said exactly that, and I told him he was finally correct about me. Grandma arrived next, without apology, carrying the authority that only a person who has watched a family for decades can carry, and she stood between us like a referee who is not neutral but deeply fair. And she told Dad that peace built on one daughter swallowing herself was not peace but avoidance, and that if he wanted calm so badly, he could try asking Madison to stop clipping my wings. And then she turned to me and said that the line I had drawn was clean and that I did not need to redraw it this afternoon to make anyone comfortable, and she squeezed my arm and told me that my mother would have said the same, and then she did something so simple and devastatingly kind that I had to look away for a moment. because she straightened the metal on my coat as if it were a crooked picture in the hallway and said, with a small smile, that I was finally in focus. Madison returned from wherever she had retreated, not in tears, but in that posture that announces war without the honesty of calling it war. Phone clutched like a weapon, stride clipped, voice already raised, and she fired off the words she always keeps ready for me. That I had made her look small and unaccomplished and selfish on a day that was supposed to be hers, and I listened without interrupting, because defending against that script would have strapped me back into the role she preferred. And when she ran out of breath, I gave her the one thing I had denied her all day, a choice, and not the kind you can stall or soften, but a real fork in the road, and I told her that the tribute and scholarship could remain as a gift registered in both of their names, exactly as I had announced it, or I would quietly remove their names this evening and redirect the endowment under our mother's name only, with no press, no scene, and no further comment from me, and then I would leave so she could have whatever picture she wanted without me in it, and, because it was a choice tied to values rather than optics, she was cornered by her own public image, which meant she could not reject the gift without confirming every criticism she feared. Tyler, to his credit, did not let the moment slide into a theatrical standoff, because he stepped forward with a steady voice and said that a marriage worth building could withstand a 2-minute tribute to a woman who had shaped both of us, and that he supported keeping the scholarship exactly as announced because it said something about who they wanted to be together, and Madison blinked at him like he had switched languages, and then she did what people do when they cannot bear to lose face, but also cannot stomach the truth, which is that she said she would accept it for appearances, and I told her appearances were her business, and that legacy was mine, and that we could live with the difference, and I shook Tyler's hand and wished them a long, honest marriage, and I meant it, because wishing people well costs nothing and sometimes unlocks a door they do not know they need. The planner tried to steer the evening back on course. The staff brought out the cake with that forced cheer teams perform after a near accident, and Aunt Carol drifted by whispering that she had money on whether I would dance. And I laughed because the question felt human after a day that had turned mythic, and I said I would stay for one song, and I did, with Grandma's hand in mine and her small steps matching my own, and after that I gathered my coat, checked my pager, and headed for the door, because a patient had finally pinged the system, and duty is not a word I use lightly, and as I walked past the hired photographer who had spent the day chasing curated moments, he lowered his camera and nodded at me the way people nod when they see a person decide something permanent. In the days that followed, I did not text Madison a recap or demand a thank you or pretend that something as old as our pattern could be solved by one clean move, and when a week passed and she sent a short message that asked how the scholarship applications would work. No apology, no softened words, just the practical question of process. I read it twice and felt the strangest mixture of relief and stubbornness, because while it was not contrition, it was movement, and I answered with the information she needed and told her the committee would be mostly independent and that I would keep her posted on milestones, and I left it there, not cold, not clingy, simply clear. People love tidy endings the way they love wedding photos cropped to the best angles, yet the endings that matter are the ones where you choose the next rule you will live by. So here is mine. I will not shrink to purchase peace that never arrives. I will not argue with people who need me small in order to feel big, and I will not apologize for taking the room back when the room was built partly by the work I did in the dark, and if that sounds like triumph, it is, because the justice I wanted was not to make anyone bleed, it was to stop the slow bleeding I had done for years, and on the day my sister asked me to be invisible, I refused, not with a scene, but with a sentence that turned the story. And as I closed the hospital door behind me that night and stepped into the shift I had promised to cover, I understood that I had not ruined a wedding or rewritten a family so much as I had ended a long unspoken agreement that I would disappear on command. And once you break that contract, you do not sign it again.